Very good evening, it's 8 p.m. on Brazier for you tonight. If migrants are willing to face down thousands of guns on the Polish border, can we really be so shocked when they tackle the waters of the English Channel later on? Also, as a primary school teacher receives death threats and has to go into hiding for kicking her horse, at what point does the Twitter mob give it a rest? And thanks, hubby, why Shamima Begum's cause was done no favours by an interview given by her husband in which he refused to condemn ISIS beheadings. All that's coming up. First, the news with Polly.
Good evening. Your latest GB News headlines this hour. It's compulsory for NHS frontline staff to be fully vaccinated against COVID by April next year. Around 100,000 NHS workers haven't, though, had their first dose yet. And the Health Secretary says they must unless they can prove they're medically exempt.
We must avoid preventable harm and protect patients in the NHS, protect colleagues in the NHS, and, of course, protect the NHS itself.
Well, care home workers in England have already been told they must have both jabs by this coming Thursday. Simon Wallace is the clinical lead at St Cecilia's care home, and he told GB News that staff do have a duty of care to protect their patients, but he acknowledged the care homes can't afford to lose any more staff.
There's a massive void of people already for working within the care sector, and this is only going to make it worse. But then I also feel that the people that we look after need to be protected.
Food and hospitality bosses are warning that there are no guarantees over Christmas deliveries, and they've raised concerns about acute warehouse staffing shortages which will have knock-on effects. The sector's currently seeing 10% vacancy rates, which amounts to a shortage of around 200,000 staff across the UK. Yorkshire County Cricket Club's first team coach Andrew Gale has been suspended for a historic tweet. It comes after Yorkshire came under scrutiny this week for their handling of Azim Rafiq's allegations of institutional racism at the club. The Culture Minister, Chris Phillip, has called for a full investigation and says the government will step in if cricket leaders fail to take action.
There is no place for racism in sport. Indeed, there is no place for racism anywhere in society. It must be confronted, it must be eradicated, and it should never be written off as just banter.
As you've been hearing, tensions are rising on the Poland-Belarus border, where thousands of migrants are still gathering. That comes a day after hundreds of people tried to break through barriers, cutting barbed wire fences. Polish security forces have described the influx of migrants as a coordinated attempt to enter their country, accusing the Belarusian government of launching a hybrid attack against them. SpaceX Crew Dragon capsule has splashed down safely in the Gulf of Mexico. It was the third crew launched into orbit under NASA's partnership with SpaceX. That's the rocket company formed in 2002 by the billionaire entrepreneur Elon Musk. The crew spent 199 days at the International Space Station. And now they're home. You're up to date. I'm back in an hour.
Well, we start as we did last night with news from a far-flung border that may offer clues about the wherewithal and the willingness of European countries, including the UK, to control an influx of illegal migrants. Thousands of predominantly young Middle Eastern men have set up a 1-mile-long camp on the Polish border looking for a way into the EU, but held back by a huge military presence there. Earlier today, the man who's manufactured this migrant crisis, the Belarusian leader, Alexander Lukashenko, warned that any fighting on the border could drag Russia into the conflict.
Right now, after nightfall, this is how Polish troops see their frontier. The temperature will fall to a degree or so above freezing, and the lighter smudges are campfires, surrounded by migrants who thought they were heading for Western Europe. The Poles have drones with night vision capability and helicopters too. All the military equipment that NATO membership provides. But the scene below is as low-tech as it comes, as this Polish pilot traverses part of the 250-mile-long border with Belarus. The scene below could be almost medieval. Certainly on the ground there is something primitive about this standoff. Poland has more than 15,000 uniformed personnel stationed here under a state of emergency. On the other side of the EU border, the number of migrants has grown to at least 3,000 or 4,000. Young men probe the fence, chopping down silver birch trees and using them to flatten the razor wire. Polish forces respond with tear gas and get a few rocks thrown at them in return. It's a tinderbox, and amid reports of gunfire today, blanks or live rounds, nobody seems to know, there is anxiety in Poland that bloodshed can't be far off.
In that particular camp near the border, there are around 1,000 people, mostly young men, as you could see in the videos published yesterday. It's clear these are aggressive actions that we must repel, fulfilling our obligations as a member of the European Union. We must protect the citizens of Poland.
This is the middle of nowhere, but it's become somewhere of importance. These are pictures taken from the Belarusian side of the border now, wood being collected for campfires as Polish bulldozers repair fence damage just a few feet away. The migrants are predominantly young Middle Eastern males, but there are enough women and children for this to become a heart-rending humanitarian crisis that can't be ignored. What will the Belarusian hard men do? They brought the migrants here, human ammunition in a war on the west, but now they're stuck. Will Lukashenko's troops take them to safety or keep them here as pawns? Far from backing down, the Belarusian leader has done an extraordinary interview today in which he warned that any fighting on the border could draw in Russia.
If, God forbid, we make any mistake, if we take a wrong step, then it will instantly drag Russia into this maelstrom, and it's the largest nuclear-armed power. I am not a madman. I understand very well what this could lead to.
It's not just Poland. In the Baltic states, in Lithuania, the army reserves are being trucked in to help hold back any migrant surge. Those who get into the EU via its easternmost border will head west to Germany, but also, possibly, to the UK. Which is why what happens at the camp that has formed on a Polish border that few Britons can identify on a map may yet have a bearing on the UK's own migrant crisis. These young men, many of them from Iraq, are not likely to be deterred by the waters of the English Channel if they succeed in getting past thousands of Polish guns.
Let's turn to Sir Andrew Wood, who's a former British ambassador to Moscow. Sir Andrew, really appreciate your time this evening. Thanks ever so much. When it comes to this strategy, and it does seem to be a strategy of weaponising migrants, is the guiding mind behind it, do you think, in Moscow or in Minsk or somewhere in between?
I think it's a combination. You have to realise the degree to which over the last 2 years Russia has declined into a dictatorship and into a close association with Lukashenko, who used to be described as the last dictator in Europe. The Russian aim overall is to absorb Belarus into its orbit and to rely on Lukashenko to do that. I think that's a dangerous aim for them, but it is also dangerous for us. Another aim of both presidents now is to divide and weaken European cohesion, including that of the European Union, which is fairly strained anyway at this time, so it is dangerous. At the same time, it is also, as the Poles have said, in effect, a licensed invasion of their country, and the migrants are being used as weapons in that disruptive venture.
Do you think, Sir Andrew, there are other motivations in play here? I mean, one of the suggestions is that, on one level, this is a money-making exercise for the Belarusians. They can charge, well, who knows what for the visas that allow people to fly into Minsk. Surely it couldn't be about something quite so grubby.
Sorry, I shouldn't laugh, but I presume they were given the visas. They were pretty much recruited to fly into Minsk. The number of flights into Minsk has been much higher than is normal. None of them are actually wishing to come to Minsk. They are wishing to come here as a way to go into the European Union. I was last week in Lithuania. There was some discussion about that, but they were the first country to be threatened. They and the Latvians are also putting up fences against this, because the idea of having huge numbers of people forced through into their countries is surely intolerable.
Yeah. Is it intolerable, is it unconscionable, do you think, for Lukashenko to see what's happening at the border, hear the recriminations from humanitarian agencies saying something must be done, and do you think he's got it within him to accept that he's brought this about, his people have bussed these migrants to the border, and if they're to survive this winter, then he has to get them back to Minsk, or at least to the safety of cities inside Belarus, because if they stay at the border, many of them will die.
That is true, and it's exactly what he should do. He is a man, however, who is perfectly ready to kill his own countrymen, so it may be that he won't do that. I don't know how this is going to work out. They may rightly believe that we have more compassion than they do, and that makes it very difficult for the Poles to accept that they've got to take all these people in, let alone the Germans and so on and so forth. If they did that, others would no doubt be sent along and flown into Minsk on manufactured passports, and everything would just go ahead, and it would become a permanent threat to the rest of us.
So, Andrew, do you think within the Kremlin itself, there may be some internal dissent there about a policy, given Vladimir Putin's self-image, I suppose, as the sort of defender of European values on one level, maybe not European or Christian values, but certainly no friend of radical Islam or the idea of some observers say of the of a demographic change in Europe, which immigration is behind to some degree. Do you think there may be voices raised in the corridors about the Kremlin that this is not something that the Kremlin ought to be supporting?
I think the Kremlin will support it as long as they think it's going to be a success. And at present they are saying it's us who are being inhuman by not satisfying human rights and letting these people in, as though the Russians would if it were done the other way around. I don't think there can be any doubt, however, that the Russians have connived, at the very least, with Lukashenko in putting forward this actually terrible use of innocent people. I can see why, if you're in Iraq or Syria, you might want to find an easy way to come into the rest of Europe, and that you would therefore believe Belarusians saying the ideal way is to come to us, and here's a plane to do it, and you just walk through. I can see also why, as human beings, they are very alarmed and distressed about being herded by the Belarusians towards the possibility of getting into Poland and into Germany, which is what they do talk about mostly. And their frustration and feeling of betrayal could be vented on us in the West, rather than the Belarusian or Russian people who have brought them to this pass.
British Ambassador to Moscow, Sir Andrew, thanks ever so much for your time. Thank you. joining me now, the editor of Voices from Belarus, Evgeny Andreychik. Evgeny Andreychik, thanks so much for your time. Thanks for joining us here on GB News. I put the question there to Sir Andrew Wood, a former British ambassador to Moscow. Is Alexander Lukashenko the kind of man who, faced with what may be a massive loss of life, a humanitarian crisis on his own territory, will start to bus some of the migrants that he bussed to the border back to Minsk and safety?
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me today. So actually, we cannot expect something from the Belarusian current government, as they actually organized all these charters from different countries to Minsk in order for migrants to move to the European Union. So actually, it is difficult to expect something from this government. As we can see now, people are on the Belarusian side near the Polish border, and Belarusian government does not let them back to Minsk, back to safety. So they're not allowed to enter nor the European Union nor the go back. So actually, it's kind of difficult to say.
Evgeny, from where you're sitting, does it look like there is a very real prospect of what is a tinderbox there, whether it's between some of the migrants who were looking at pictures of them, almost using the tree trunks as battering rams against the police lines. The police then retaliate with tear gas and spray, and then the rocks come in from the other side. It is a tinderbox there. It is something that could spin out of control, and not just between the migrants and the Polish police, but between the Polish forces and the Belarusian forces. How tense is it, do you think?
We actually have a lot of information and lots of video content which people are sending to us, and it could be clearly seen there that those provocations are not like the people who are make those provocations. They're a minority of the migrants, because as we can see, they have scissors to break the fence. They have some tools which not all of the migrants have. So actually, we consider that there is provocators from the Belarusian side or Belarusian security forces which make this kind of provocation, and then other migrants starting like to make the same actions. So the majority of migrants are not. Probably are not as aggressive as they could be, but for sure some tensions could be, and it depends on the level of provocation whether it will decrease or increase. But I hope that the situation will not continue to destabilize.
Evgeny Andreychik, thank you so much for your time. Thanks very much indeed. Let's turn then to our home and security editor, Mark White, who joins us now. Mark, welcome to you. I think when we talked about this yesterday, there was a feeling that we wouldn't get through the night without a serious incident. We seem to have done.
Yes, but there's no doubt it's very tense there. And although your last interviewee was talking about only a small number of migrants involved in provocation or clashes with the security forces on the Polish side, the longer they're there, the more desperate they're going to get. So the more there is the chance, sadly, of there being some very significant confrontations there, because what's happening, and we could see from the footage that was being played there as the helicopters sort of tilted up a bit, you could see in the tree line those members of the Belarusian security services who have pushed these migrants right down towards the border fence that the Polish authorities are guarding and determined that no one will cross. They've been given authority to turn anyone back, even though they may claim asylum, even if they get over that fence and claim asylum, they will still be turned back. That is how seriously the Poles have decided that they are taking it. There's now some 17,500 soldiers, police and border agents who are in that area and determined, as I say, to continue, Colin, to try and push them back.
What we don't know, Mark, is ultimately what the final destination for a lot of these people is. I mean, we've heard them chanting Germany, Germany. I've seen at least one interview with one of them saying that he only wants to get to Germany. But the truth is, a lot of these people have no papers, as you see from some of the exchanges there on the border. Some of them don't want to play by the rules, as it were. We don't know where they're bound.
No, and that's, I think, the concern that a lot of EU member states have, as well as, of course, the UK, because we know from previous history that a proportion of those who cross into the European Union will come up towards the northwest coast of France and try to get to the UK. Some 6,500 have already, incidentally, gone to Germany, and the government there is very concerned about that, having previously, of course, had a policy back in 2015 announced by Chancellor Angela Merkel just to throw open the doors to whoever wants to come. And, of course, that resulted in 1.1 million people coming to Germany and caused them some very significant problems. So there are some real concerns. And on top of that, not just the sort of migratory issue, the asylum-seeking issue, there is real security concerns as well. The Lithuanian government say that over recent weeks, some 4,000 migrants have crossed from Belarus into their country. They're bolstering their border with more troops today. But they said amongst those who crossed from Belarus were at least 24 migrants who were members of prescribed groups, terrorist organizations. Now, that has got to ring alarm bells amongst many countries in the West who, as you say, Colin, are often unaware of who these individuals are unless they come up on specific databases, because as a tactic, told to them, advised by the people traffickers, they throw their passports, driving licenses, any kind of identification documents away to make it much harder for them to be returned to their country of origin.
Mark, it's such a difficult thing to do this, and I'm reluctant to ask you, but you're the man for the question in a sense as to where this goes from here in coming days and weeks. I mean, this is a standoff the likes of which, well, I can't recall anything like it. You've got it's an immovable object and an irresistible force in some respects, and neither side are prepared to back down. And the filling, unfortunately, in the sandwich are thousands of migrants. And yes, many of them may be young men, but there's a sprinkling of women and children as well. And the obvious thing, the moral thing to do would be for Lukashenko, having bussed them to the border, to get them back to safety. But he doesn't strike us as the kind of person likely to do that.
No, it could get very messy there, to be honest, with what's happening at the moment. Interestingly, Andrei Lugovoy, the foreign minister in Russia, put out there today the possibility of compensating Alexander Lukashenko and his regime for taking these migrants back and then processing them there, or perhaps returning them to their country of origin. Now, you might think that this is just inconceivable, that the European Union could not be blackmailed like this into paying this dictator who's caused this problem in the first place to then solve the problem. But look at what happened 5 years ago with Turkey, when President Erdogan in Turkey felt that he was being left on his own, effectively, to deal with a very significant problem of people fleeing Syria. He opened his borders, allowed this caravan to process right up through the European Union. And very shortly thereafter, the European Union decided to give him £5 billion. So we might be looking at that. We might be looking at a multi-billion-dollar, pound, whatever you want to call it, payout to this dictator who has caused this misery in the first place.
That might be the most elegant solution. Pay him off, build the wall, and next time it won't be so easy to get in. Mark, thanks very much indeed. Mark White there. After the break, as a primary school teacher filmed kicking a horse goes into hiding after getting death threats, we ask if Britain now puts the welfare of animals sometimes above people.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News. Well, have a look at this video filmed by hunt saboteurs in Leicestershire and watched by considerably over 1 million people. Presenter Chris Packham is demanding that the RSPCA investigate this incident, and they are. The police say they're ready to assist too. On Twitter, the woman, the rider, is being widely vilified. She's faced death threats and has been forced into hiding, reportedly. Having been at the still centre of a Twitter storm, I can imagine to some degree how she might be feeling, remorseful, embarrassed and really rather frightened by this stage. Deservedly so, many will say. She is, according to several online comments, an evil psychopath who deserves to be kicked and worse. She exemplifies the ruling class who sustain the barbarism of trail hunting. Well, she's not a toff, actually. She's a primary school teacher. Like many of the 500,000 Britons who keep horses, she's probably not awash with cash. One of the great urban myths about horsey folk is that they're all loaded. A few are, but a great many scrimp and save to pursue a hobby that takes over lives almost like no other. I should know, my late wife and I decided that the best way of keeping our children occupied and exhausted and able to manage risk was by getting them to ride. And although I'm an equestrian ignoramus who grew up in the city, I no longer see horses as Disney characters who crave nothing more than an apple and a kind word. The first time I recognised this was when we were lent a pony. It got its foot caught in a fence, whereupon a neighbouring New Forest pony backed up towards it and repeatedly kicked it with both hooves with a force that would have broken a man's leg. It was vile behaviour to my human eyes, but perfectly natural in the wild, where the pecking order is very real and very brutal. I say this because although the rider in the video you saw a moment ago was clearly out of order, she isn't the incarnation of cruelty. I'm not defending her, that would probably lead to death threats after all, but I am encouraging some perspective. I get very suspicious when one person, so few people have leapt to her defence, finds themselves on the receiving end of a massive social media pile-on, especially one spurred on, feels like the right phrase for this story, by activists who tell a partial story. For instance, it's widely claimed that this female rider punched her horse. I don't know if I can rewind to those pictures, but let me reprise what you saw a few moments ago. She didn't. She slapped it. And you can see that in the picture. She slapped it across the face. Not great. There you go. But if this were a court hearing where there was actual evidence, a judge would see a very big difference between a slap and a punch, I can tell you. The other thing is this. There is a gap opening up. It's long been there, actually, but it's getting bigger all the time, it seems. On one side, predominantly urban commentators, on the other, mainly rural folk whose comprehension of animals is based rather more on experience. And I can guarantee that many of the latter, the country folk, will have seen the reaction to this video and felt a sense of moral paralysis, unable to speak out, to contextualise, for fear of being seen as an apologist for animal cruelty, but also conscious of the essential calculus of having a horse. They tend to have the brain of a toddler inside half a tonne of unpredictable bone and muscle. I mention this because horsey folk know that many equestrian injuries don't happen on horseback. They happen when they're being led around in and out of stables or a lorry, which is what the woman in the video was attempting. I know this is definitely true because I've been knocked off my feet by a stampeding horse, and I've made at least one trip to hospital with a child who was left concussed. The incident I'm thinking of, my lad was leading a pony, which another took a swipe at. It missed his pony, but it connected with his head. He was wearing a riding hat, thank goodness. My point is that generally a horse will be ungovernable if it senses fear or imagines you to be weak. Nature is red in tooth and claw and all that stuff. Of course, it should be possible to do this without excessive physical chastisement, but often it's only an appeal to baser instincts that works. A threatening tone of voice, an offer of food, a strong shove, maybe a slap on the shoulder. It's not sadistic, it's sometimes necessary. Get it wrong, be weak, and bad things happen. A horse that's out of control is a hazard to itself, passing cars, dogs, kids, etc., etc. To which some people will say, probably right now, if you have to control them with force, to compel them with a slap, then it's better that people don't keep horses at all. 5 million Britons either ride or have ridden horses. If you made it illegal, as some vegans and others want, it's not just people who will suffer. There are currently about a million horses in Britain. How many would be left if they were permitted to live only as undomesticated animals in the wild? A few thousand, perhaps. Worse still, we would, as a society, lose something I think that's really quite vital, a connection with an older and yes, tougher way of life based on the most successful interspecies collaboration in human history. That's the Brazier angle. Let's turn to Jamie Blackett, a farmer and writer and conservationist in Dumfries and Galloway. Jamie, thanks ever so much. We tread fearfully into this territory, don't we?
Well, we certainly do, Colin, and I think you're very brave to take this one on, and possibly I am as well. But I think you're quite right to look for a bit of balance here and a sense of perspective. I've actually managed to make a few inquiries about the context of this incident. I'm told that the pony had just dragged a child down the road. The people with the camera were hunt saboteurs who were in a Land Rover, I think, on the road with a camera, and that no doubt heightened the tension. And I'm not excusing.
If it's a public road, it's their right to be there.
Absolutely. But I'm not excusing for 1 minute the woman's actions, which were really, I think the best one can say is very unedifying from a horseman's point of view. You should never really lose your temper like that with an animal. But I should stress that I think really what happened here was that you have to understand the context, and possibly there was an excess of maternal instinct perhaps made her lose her temper. I'm perhaps being a little bit charitable here. And I think also, horses, as you've just alluded to, do occasionally you have to let them know who's boss. And clearly the pony had been dragging a child around and had to be got under control. And it clearly was none the worse for what she did. I'm not excusing it.
Jamie, just on that point, Jamie, just to interrupt. Sorry, just on the point about letting them know.
Like a lamb.
Yeah, just on that point about letting them know who's boss. I don't know about you, but I almost feel now because there is so much unwillingness to speak candidly about this, not this incident necessarily in exclusion, but more generally about this, that actually people are not talking frankly about it. And I have a sneaking suspicion, perhaps you do too, that not a small number of people, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people in the sort of the equestrian world in the UK, they've seen this video and they've thought as you have, oh, crikey, it's not great, she's lost her temper. But it's out of all proportion with the ensuing hue and cry from Packham, the BBC presenter, from the RSPCA who then get involved, and then the police who are threatening to get involved. And, you know, if they've got inquiries to get to the bottom of, let them do it, of course. But we end up with what feels like a witch hunt, and a primary school teacher reportedly going into hiding, facing death threats. I mean, come on.
Yeah, absolutely. And Colin, I mean, what's interesting was when I first saw this on social media a couple of days ago, my first reaction was one of anger, you know, that this woman had lost her temper and was ill-treating a horse. And, you know, I didn't have any sympathy for her at all. In the last few days, as I've learned more about the case, I mean, I think the story is much more complex than that. And actually, it's almost a bigger story, really, frankly, than a woman slapping a horse. Is that, you know, there's now a young family who've had to leave their home. I understand that the school where she works has received all sorts of threats. Not just that, another school in the local area, some of these vigilantes have clearly got the wrong school, is also receiving a lot of abuse. And so you've got a local rural community there in Leicestershire, which is feeling rather under siege as a result of this. And I think Chris Packham actually really needs to be more careful. I mean, he clearly feels strongly about this. I understand that. He could have emailed the RSPCA. He didn't need to put it on social media in the way that he did, which clearly, whether it was his intent or not, has created this Twitter storm, and worse than that, this witch hunt. You know, she is now, I understand, very frightened. Her children are very frightened and traumatized by this. She's, I gather, mortified by what she did, apparently completely out of character. She's a really highly regarded school teacher. And I think as you already said, it serves to underline this growing gap between people, mostly in towns, and people in the countryside, and this awful business we've got of vigilantes going out into the countryside and really seizing the moral high ground and then using it as an opportunity to terrorize people who, after all, we're going about their lawful business. Trail hunting is legal. You know, it's a family something that is done by families with children, and it's just, I think something. There have already been some terrible incidents, people getting hurt, and this sort of witch hunt is not helping.
We'll get plenty of emails, I'm sure, from people saying, I live in the countryside and I hate hunting and all the rest of it. But I would end on this, though. I think there's a bigger question here, Jamie, raised about the fact that there will be, in Leicestershire, in Leicester, over the weekend, there will have been people slapped and given a kick about whom we know nothing and care nothing and couldn't care less, frankly. But the sight of an animal, I mean, it's just, I know the Brits have this obsession with animals, and it's wonderful that we do. But sometimes you end up with a strange moral disparity, and as you say, something that completely runs out of control and leaves behind, in this case, the inaugurated Chris Packham and others who couldn't, I imagine, foresee where it was going, and now she's in hiding. It's crazy stuff. Jamie Blackett, really good to talk to you, and thanks for treading onto this sensitive territory with me. Thanks a lot. After the break, the Scottish ballet takes it upon itself to rewrite the Nutcracker, saying it's racist and outdated.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News. Now, Shamima Begum's hopes of returning to Britain were done no favours today. Her husband gave an interview in which he refused to condemn ISIS beheadings or the use of Yazidi sex slaves. Dutch-born Jager Reidik married Shamima Begum days after she arrived in Syria as a 15-year-old in 2015. The couple had 3 children together, all of whom subsequently died. Reidik is now living in a detention centre in northern Syria, but he told his interviewer that he hoped to see the caliphate return. Begum's British citizenship was revoked by the then Home Secretary Sajid Javid. Well, with me is the director of the counter-extremist Iman network, Mohammed Hinadi. Mohammed, thanks so much for joining us today. I do appreciate it. I mean, this individual does not seem to have done Shamima Begum any great favours, but he does seem to be speaking frankly, candidly and honestly.
Yes, you're right, Colin, definitely. I mean, Shamima herself has not done herself any favours. She justified the Manchester Arena attacks back in 2015 by saying that it was basically ISIS's retaliation for the coalition's bombing of their territory that they controlled in Iraq and Syria. So her husband now is coming out and saying that I don't condone any attacks in the West, but I still believe in a caliphate. So that's basically what ISIS believes in, just without the violence. So basically, Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is active in Britain, which is active in Australia, in the US, in Canada, but it's spanned across basically the entire Muslim world. I don't believe, however, that he does. I don't believe that he's genuine about his. I don't believe, that he doesn't believe in violence, because at the end of the day, he refused to comment on the Yazidi sex slaves, and he refused to comment on ISIS's attacks against other Muslims in Syria and Iraq. And the same thing for Shamima.
Calibrated, Mohammed, almost, didn't he? He's almost miscalibrated. If he was going to completely reinvent himself and present himself as somebody thoroughly de-radicalised, he only went halfway.
Well, definitely, Colin. I mean, at the end of the day, he's been in prison in an SDF-controlled territory in northern Syria. So 6 years on, 6 years after the so-called caliphate fell, he still doesn't have any remorse. Neither does his so-called wife. At the end of the day, they have both failed as humans. She has failed as a British citizen. She's failed as a mother. She gave birth to 3 children, all of whom have died. That is extremely tragic and it's absolutely horrendous. She's failed as a so-called Muslim. She used to she was part of the morality police in Syria. She would beat women up who were not covered well enough, according to her standards. So there were also reports that she would physically stitch suicide vests to the bodies of suicide bombers, so that if they had last-minute thoughts, it would detonate. So I'm not sure people who want to have her back to the UK, she does set an example. At the end of the day, the ISIS that we were used to, the ISIS that we knew, existed in Syria and Iraq in 2014 and 2015. It controlled swaths of territory. It controlled 10 million people. But today, Colin, where does ISIS exist? It controls territory in Afghanistan. Using Shamima as an example, you set an example for her so that we don't have hundreds, if not thousands thousands more Shamimas in the future in Afghanistan.
Is there no counter-narrative to that which says actually, and I've argued this before, though actually listening to you just now rather dissuades me from my point of view, which is that you could use her, she's a revolting individual, but she could be, pragmatically speaking, she could be useful. If it could be demonstrated that she was sincere in resiling from her previous beliefs, then you could present her as part of a de-radicalisation programme. She could become a sort of poster girl for de-radicalisation, touring schools, etc., saying, don't follow this path, this is what happened to me, look how badly wrong it went, and actually I now choose to lead a different kind of life.
I mean, I completely understand that narrative. I completely understand that argument, Colin. Many would argue that she was young when she made those decisions, but that did result in the deaths of 3 of her children. She did commit crimes in Syria and Iraq. If she was to stand trial, she would stand trial in Iraq. She is originally she's got Bangladeshi heritage. The Bangladeshi government has stated that if she was to step foot in Bangladesh, she would be sentenced. She would be sentenced to death. They've got a zero tolerance approach to terrorism and to extremism. I'm not saying that she should be sentenced to death, but she should be tried in the courts of the countries where she committed the crimes. I don't think she should be given the opportunity to be she was a poster girl for Daesh, for ISIS. She should not be the poster girl for the counter-radicalization campaign in the future. ISIS will be coming back. It is already back in Afghanistan. Members of the Afghan National Forces are already flocking to ISIS, and that's part of the whole Islamist idea that we're trying to combat here. And we shouldn't be using her as part of any narrative in the future. She should pay for what she has done.
Well, I tell you what, Mohammed, the story of what's happening with ISIS in Afghanistan is a fascinating one. It's a story for another time, though, I'm afraid, but really appreciate your thoughts on Shamima Begum and her husband today, Mohammed and Adi. Last week, George Galloway told me that his native Scotland under the SNP had lurched towards being effectively a woke state. And today, perhaps more evidence that the former MP and firebrand might be onto something. Scottish Ballet has said it will be modifying its repertoire after a review of, quote, outdated and racist artistic content. In particular, what the ballet company described as elements of caricature will be removed from the Nutcracker. Let's turn to the commentator, Brian Monteith. Brian, thanks ever so much for joining us. I haven't seen the Nutcracker. Have you seen the Nutcracker? I've never seen it.
Many times.
You are the man for the job. Were you struck?
I always found it was a very good ballet to go on a first date with. It was a very subtle way of showing your feminine side.
and they seem to be, Scottish Ballet are particularly, this version's been running for some 50 years, they're particularly exercised by, I think, a Chinese scene which seems to peddle stereotypes of Chinese people and possibly some Arab stereotypes as well. But have you not been struck? Did your date ditch you on the spot because you were consorting with such racist tripe, or did they not notice it either?
No, and nor have I found any people from China or Arabia, in that broad term, to complain about the Nutcracker. I could understand people being concerned about the Opium Wars, but the Chinese tea scene, the Arabian dance, which is effectively about coffee, is really, there's nothing in it that is at all racist. What might be said is that obviously the performers have historically always been predominantly, if not solely, white because of ballet's origins. And so by that nature, I think there has been a growing objection to the dancers always appear white and made up as Chinese or people from Arabia.
I'm just looking at some remarks from Scottish Ballet on this, Brian. I mean, they're committed, they say, to changes in the characters, the choreography, the costumes, and committed more generally to, quote, drive anti-racism in ballet. We've talked before about why, under the SNP, perhaps Scotland has, as I mentioned from George Galloway's interview last week, lurched in a very woke direction. But actually, in the arts, this is more of a UK-wide phenomenon. But this idea that it can't just be about the pleasure of the punter anymore. There's got to be a bit of social instruction coming along as well.
Yes, this is undoubtedly cultural Marxism, and it is being imported from the United States. The first writings about this were about 2014. And what we're seeing is that when some Americans cough, we sneeze. It's the same old story. We're picking it up. And the truth of it is that, for instance, the Arabian dance scene, where the girl is essentially clad in a bikini top and pantaloons. She's looking as a ballet dancer. That is now objected to. That is a stereotype. Well, that was in the Ottoman Empire period when this was conceived and written. And so what are we to expect now? The headscarf on? What actually is the objection? It's a children's ballet. And people, of course, are actually looking to influence us and break down our narratives, our histories, our traditions, because they want to impose their worldview. It is cultural Marxism, and it's just like what happened in China itself with the Cultural Revolution.
Year zero. It's year zero. Brian, thanks ever so much. Brian Monteith there. And we're going to stick with some of the themes raised there by Brian. It's time for Culture Clash. And what does it take? Here's the question. What does it take to be put on the blacklist of speakers invited to appear at Cambridge University? We know somebody who might have an answer to that question. Andrew Doyle is here. A blacklist at Cambridge University. Are you on it?
I'm worried that I might be. I gave a talk at the Cambridge Union and I was part of a debate. Yes. Maybe I am on it. I don't know. Did I say anything offensive? Who knows? I mean, this is a bizarre idea. So this is the president of the union has failed to intervene, he says, when the historian, what was his name? Sorry, I should know this. The historian who was doing an impersonation of Hitler in the chamber as part of the debate about good taste. Okay, so the idea of it wasn't to cause offence. Actually, it was to cause offence, to make a point about taste and a lack of taste and that kind of thing. And the president of the union has actually said that he should have intervened at the time. He said he'd had a couple of glasses of wine and so didn't think it was necessary to intervene. But actually, it wasn't necessary to intervene because historically, both Cambridge and Oxford unions have had controversial speakers there. And the whole point is that you can air sometimes quite objectionable views, and you've got a chamber full of some of the smartest young people in the world there to challenge it and there to expose it. If it's a bad idea, it will not survive scrutiny. So the idea that speakers who are potentially causing offence, problematic, all the terms that they usually use, should be on a list and that they will never be invited again. Not only that, the president has said he's going to circulate that list to other unions as well.
Helpful.
And we haven't seen the list because the list is in private, so nobody knows who's on the list. This is, I mean, it has been described as Stalinist. They've got a point. I think this is a very, very bad idea. And I think, as I say, ideas should be aired.
Andrew Graham Dixon.
Sorry, it's totally slipped my mind.
I'd like to say I pulled it from the back of mine, but actually somebody whispered it.
Yes, and to be fair, I didn't see Andrew Graham Dixon's impersonation of Hitler. I don't know the context. I wasn't there, but I do know that he wouldn't have been doing it in order to endorse the views of the Third Reich. I mean, that's absolutely clear, and I think those kids are intelligent enough to know that.
Can we talk a little bit about a name that's cropped up a lot over the last month or two, Kathleen Stock? No longer, I'm guessing, unless she's serving out a notice at Sussex University, but might be one of those people who goes to work alongside your friend and my recent interviewee, Peter Boghossian, who became quite a cause celeb for reasons you're about to explain. And she might work at his new university.
Well, I mean, it's not his university, but he is certainly one of the founding faculty members of the university in Texas, which has been set up in order to promote the pursuit of knowledge, freedom of speech, free inquiry. In fact, all of the things that universities are meant to do. I mean, this should be the default expectation of a university. And the fact that a group of people, including Barry Weiss, by the way, who you'll recall resigned from the New York Times in quite spectacular fashion with a really interesting resignation letter that went viral because she explained how it had been ideologically captured and how it was impossible to work.
It was meant to write the awkward pieces, and she wrote one too many awkward pieces. And
that was part of her point. That was part of the reason she was there. And similarly with Peter Boghossian, who was at Portland State University in Oregon, and a similar thing in a way, resigned because he made the point that the students there are not being taught to think. They're being taught to echo a pre-existing ideological dogma. And so he wrote this resignation letter. It was a spectacular letter, and it went viral. And now he's going to be part of this new establishment, along with Neil Ferguson as well, the historian.
Yeah.
And I think this is a very good thing because ultimately we need more institutions like this. I think, particularly in America, now we have a slightly different situation over here, but I think in America, so many of the institutions have been captured sort of beyond repair, I think, at this point. And so therefore, we will need new universities.
Some alternatives. I'm just going to end on, Andrew, an unrelated story. It's unrelated to our conversation. It's the poll that we conducted earlier. As a primary school teacher filmed kicking a horse goes into hiding after getting death threats. People rather than animals, you'd be surprised by the results. Have a look online.
Hello again. Clear spells will prevail across Scotland and Northern Ireland during the next 24 hours, albeit with further blustery showers in places. Generally cloudy and damp elsewhere across a large part of England and Wales because of this slow-moving cold front. It is a weakening feature, but it is bringing a lot of cloud, low cloud at that, and some outbreaks of rain and drizzle, whilst unstable westerlies affect Scotland and Northern Ireland. Showers at times and perhaps a more organised feature pushing through during the evening, first part of Wednesday, to bring some more prolonged showers. But that clears. Clear skies then for much of Scotland and Northern Ireland, whilst largely cloudy conditions stick around for England and Wales, away from the far southeast, which could see some clear spells. But mild for England and Wales as we start off Wednesday, albeit very gloomy. A lot of low cloud covering the hills and some persistent wet weather for parts of the southwest, Wales into the Midlands, East Anglia, Lincolnshire. That rain on and off through the day, I think, easing perhaps into the afternoon, but it's going to stay grey and overcast. Some brightness coming through in the far south and southeast, whilst it's a sunnier day for North Wales, Northern England, and Scotland and Northern Ireland will see further blustery showers coming through. Some strengthening of the winds in the far north and northwest and some heavier rain pushing through on Wednesday evening in the far north of Scotland. Elsewhere, a lot of cloud remains, and that cloud again lowering to cover hills, some misty coasts as well, and some patchy light rain and drizzle at times. But a mild night to come once again in the south, whilst it's a bit colder further north. Thursday then looks largely dry, but not entirely sunny. There will be a lot of cloud cover, particularly across southern and central parts of the UK. Perhaps some dense fog to start off things in the south. But it does brighten up in the south whilst this cloud drifts north. And then Friday it turns more unsettled generally in the north of the UK. And on Saturday, Sunday, things look a lot drier.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.